So it gives me great pleasure to introduce two extraordinary New Yorkers. The first is Frank Rich, and Frank Rich is someone who I actually today am feeling sad about because I open my New York Times on Sundays, and if you are like me, opening the Sunday Times and going straight to the page where they say Frank Rich, page C46, the fact that I can't do that anymore, I am in mourning over. And I want to just say the reason is because there are few people who write with the lucidity, the intelligence, in such a compelling and thoughtful way. And so we miss Frank Rich at the New York Times, but I understand he has another gig, and I'm sure we'll hear about that. The second person I want to introduce, of course, is the guy who, as I wrote, is not your mother's NEA chairman, and that would be Rocco Landesman. And I think the president made an extraordinarily bold choice in naming Rocco Landesman chairman of the NEA. And I think we're seeing the dividends of that. And Rocco continues to soar as the chairman. He challenges us, doesn't always buy into our wonderful rhetoric. But at the end of the day, he is the authentic real deal. And we are greatly blessed as a nation to have him in this role. So please welcome Frank Rich and Rocco Landesman.
Staging you here.
Right.
Good afternoon. Nice to see all of you. Rocco, I never thought when the...
What are we doing here? We were at Angels in America just the other day, the opening of the original production. We were in the theater.
Next thing I know, the FBI is interviewing me about you, and
Indeed.
You
didn't. Fortunately, you didn't tell them the truth.
I didn't tell them the whole truth. Anyway, it's great to be here, and I'm... well, someone can turn on the mics, maybe?
Here.
Okay.
Very good now.
Okay. I'm very, as a friend of yours, I'm very proud of what you've done, and the gracious introduction said, you're not anyone's previous NEA chairman. In fact, I remember for my sins, I was asked to run a panel at the Kennedy School about 10 years ago with all the living NEA chairs of that time, and they were all alive except Nancy Hanks. And I can say
Bill Ivey, I think, is here.
Yes, I'm not
now.
sure
Yeah.
Bill was in place yet. Bill was a great NEA chair. I think Jane Alexander was still, but anyway.
You're going to hate me for interrupting, but I'm going to interrupt. Can you swap chairs?
Yeah, that's what I thought. That's what I thought. They said stage right, then the guy said sit here. Okay. Okay. Sure. That'll be better. Okay.
Luckily, it's not the same Ford Theater where Lincoln was shot.
Hadn't thought of that.
Anyway, let's talk about a bunch of things, including your work at the NEA. But before we get to that, long before you were even a Broadway producer, you were up in arms about the contamination of nonprofit cultural institutions by the profit motive. It's been a theme of yours that you continued daringly when you were in the commercial theater, and of course it's still an important point of yours. And talk about that and the state of play with that right now, in your view.
It's a pretty simple and straightforward situation. I think it's getting a lot worse. The resident theater movement, as we know it today, was largely started by the Ford Foundation, with a small assist from the NEA and a few others. And the notion was that the marketplace wasn't going to determine what wasn't going to be the final determinant of what is of artistic value, and the resident theaters were created. The Guthrie Arena Stage, the Public Theater, Yale Rep. Mark Taper, et cetera, that whole first generation of great resident theaters. The concept was that you have a subsidy, and that gives you a protection to do work that is more venturesome, that is not dependent on the exigencies of the box office and those kinds of things. And you can do work that's bolder, that's more experimental. That's why you have a subsidy. That's why you have protection. What has happened now is that whether it's because of the financial crisis or the theaters have just gotten cleverer or whatever, the theaters are starting to produce work for transfer to Broadway, or even worse, work in conjunction with Broadway producers who give them enhancement money for their productions. So they're choosing seasons with a view to a transfer, or at the very least, national critical attention and the kind of thing that's going to mitigate risk-taking. And that's a very alarming, did I just lose the mic here? Okay. That's a very alarming prospect as you look at what the original impulse was. To me, it's a complete abnegation of that original impulse, which is to provide protection for work that is venturesome. And more theaters are doing it.
Well,
And not just theaters, by the way.
right. No, whether it's a Harley Davidson exhibition at a major art museum, or lots of pops programming at symphony orchestras, or you could even argue at places like the City Ballet. I mean, you could definitely argue that an eye is now on the cash register. But is this just built into the American way? I think of the public theater. The public theater has taken a lot of heat and ridicule over, moving On the Town, moving bloody Andrew Jackson, throwing money away. But look back at Joe Papp's history. People remember him. He was, if anything, the godfather of nonprofit theater. He wasn't the first, wasn't ahead of Tyrone Guthrie and Zelda Fitzhandler, but he was certainly the leader, the messiah of it. He allowed Hair to be transferred in 1968, and without any of the proceeds going to the public. And then he thought, oh, maybe I should do this myself. So he did it himself with a chorus line. But what people forget now is that he kept doing it with shows that were just as disastrous as those that were moved by the more recent incarnations of that institution. No one remembers he moved Cafe Crown, the Human Comedy. Is it built into the whole idea of producing or being an artistic director of any kind of cultural institution in America, that in the end you're going to go for the gold, whether it's Broadway or a huge box office or some kind of commercialization?
It's partly, in America more than any other place, we have an ethos of success. Success as a goal, as an object in its own right, is venerated and valued. At the same time, I think you have a passage, a shift in the power dynamic in many of these institutions from the original founders, the artistic directors, to boards and managing directors. The managing directors are really the person in these organizations who serve the boards. And as I look at the terrain, as I go across the country, I see more and more, the fulcrum is tilted more and more toward the managing director, who answers to the board and to the financial concerns of the institution. And the board, of course, wants metrics of success. They want to see asses in the seats, box office revenue, national attention. They want the organization to be successful, and the measure of that from the boards and the managing director. And you have situations now in many institutions where you really, in effect, don't have an artistic director at all, where the artistic director has retired or been fired, and the managing director takes that on. In the St. Louis Rep, the managing director simply became the artistic director. Or where you have a duality, the managing director takes on more and more influence. That's happening everywhere, and I think is a pernicious development.
Have we lost a certain American philanthropic type? Because I think of someone like Roger Stevens, who I'm sure
One of my predecessors, by the way.
Right.
The first chair of the NEA.
Oh, he was?
Yes.
I didn't even realize that.
Yeah.
All right, so here's a guy who was, by all accounts, could barely put a sentence together, but was a very successful.
You don't have to be able to do that to be at the head of the NEA.
Well, or any public service, the government. But he made a ton of money in real estate. At one point, he sold the Empire State Building or bought it. Yet he really, in serving in a bunch of institutions, including both Kennedy Center in its original incarnation and Lincoln Center, really believed that you give this money and try to do adventurous work. And think of the first season at the Vivian Beaumont. It wasn't even it was like I think it was still in the temporary quarters before they built the Beaumont, but it was like Eugene O'Neill's Marco Millions. as a producer, he did things like West Side Story. He subsidized stuff that really wasn't aimed at being a big success. Sometimes it was. He would do Arthur Miller and Tennessee Williams plays after they were past it, creatively and commercially. Is that kind of donor gone now from these boards?
I think if you look at the whole, I shouldn't use this phrase, donor class, I think you've seen a shift there too, from here's an exciting artist, let's give him or her the money to work and flourish, to let's build a successful, again that word, a successful organization. And because we are used to doing this way in our business, because we are good businessmen, we want to see metrics of that success. We want to be able to measure it. And I think there you get into some difficult ground.
It's hard to me. Yes, I'll leave this point behind, and I see what you're saying, but I guess it's hard for me to understand why someone, a benefactor in that way, would want to be in. You can always jack up the box office. You could do the Nutcracker 12 months a year. You could do Christmas Carol 6 months a year. You could do the best of Andrew Lloyd Webber pop concerts and call it symphonic or whatever, as much as you want, and you could sell tickets. Where's the pride in that as a donor? I just don't understand.
What's happened, I think, is that failure has become increasingly embarrassing. These folks don't want to fail, because failure is there's a stigma attached to it, and yet the very essence of the artistic enterprise involves failure. Involves failure almost constantly. You have to be able to take the risk. You have to be able to look bad, and to fail. And many times the donors, the boards, the managing directors don't want to have that embarrassment. And I think that's a shift in the culture that I've observed even in the short time I've been around.
Well, that's depressing. Well, but we'll move on to something.
Well, we could ask the people here. I mean, I think that's happening. I think the challenge for the private sector and for the foundations is to keep that spirit of risk and being venturous alive and allow for failure.
Well, I agree. A more recent theme of yours, it's in characteristic Rocco fashion, caused some heat because you actually do say what you think and mean what you say. So rare not only in your current job, but in Washington, and perhaps somewhat rare in the so-called cultural arts community. This issue of supply and demand, that you feel that in essence, the art establishment, the cultural establishment in the broadest sense has been overbuilt in America. There are more institutions than audiences or even art require. Explain this.
Well, this is the craziest thing I've encountered. And one of the neat things about my job, the portfolio, as pathetic as it is in terms of the funding, does, yes, and OMB, we'll be on the phone tomorrow. Please stop using that word pathetic. Yeah. They hate that word, but I think it's an apt description of the NEA budget. At least there's a platform, a bully pulpit. I have a stage, which I didn't really realize I had until I had it, where what you say is taken seriously, and sometimes to a fault. Like in this last case, I'm wondering why everybody in the arts community takes me so much more seriously than does my family or my staff. My wife Debbie, my kids.
Discussion.
I think it's because my family and my staff knows me so much better. But what I said struck me as almost stupidly obvious, and it caused this incredible furor. I mean, a real uproar. I mean, the blogosphere went crazy, and people were, suggesting letter writing campaigns and that I should be fired and so on and so forth. Well, all I said was that we have a lot of surveys at the NEA, and there are many others that show that participation, at least in the performing arts and the visual arts, has been declining measurably. At the same time, the number of artistic institutions has been proliferating exponentially. In my hometown of St. Louis, there used to be one theater, the Muni Opera, that did Broadway summer stock. Now there are probably 25 or 26 or 27 full-time resident theaters, professional resident theaters. That's all in the time, since between I went away and went back. There is a disconnect there somewhere. number of institutions are proliferating, audiences are declining. Can't we at least ask the question whether so-called supply and demand, and maybe that's an unfortunate marketplace type term, but reflects what we're talking about, should be brought more into line, should be rationalized. Immediately there were people writing letters to the editor saying, now we're going to have death panels at the NEA, and and so on and so forth. We at least have to have a discussion. That's the gorilla in the room. It was precipitated when I first mentioned it at a symposium at Arena Stage, because from my perspective, not-for-profit organizations do not pay a living wage to the people who work there. I was married for 18 years to a brilliant set designer, Heidi Ettinger, who would do 2 or 3 shows in a year, in a season, and if she did them in resident theaters, was not able to to pay the bills based on what you're paid. Multiply that times the directors, the actors, and I think this is true of a lot of institutions, not just in the theater, where you cannot pay a dignified wage to the people who work there. Maybe we should have fewer institutions with more resources. And by the way, not the biggest ones necessarily, or the most economically viable ones, but the most interesting ones, the most compelling ones, rather than having every startup supported and every street corner theater existing can't pay the people who work there. There may be too many of them. It's at least is a question to ask and to talk about. I don't know. People were upset that I even brought it up.
No, let me ask you a sub piece of that. Do you think that the secondary and or let's specify the less worthy artistic institutions, and let's posit that there are some in every field, cannibalize the ones that are good? Like take a first-tier organization that is great, the Philadelphia Orchestra. Do you think that it's just shocking, at least to me as an American, that this lodestar of American high culture or international high culture could be flailing financially to the extent that it is? Do you think that in some ways it's a zero-sum game, that audiences, donors, they're going to whatever, a community theater doing Annie,
Well, it may be a zero-sum game, and a lot of the response that I got was, how dare you say that we can't increase demand? How dare you say that? Because we are going to increase demand. Well, it hasn't been done for 20 years. So you do have to ask the question whether you should align it. Now, some theaters may be, or some orchestras or some ballets or whatever, may be mismanaged or not run properly, and there's a winnowing out process that goes on. But I don't think there are infinite resources, and you can't keep multiplying the number of artistic institutions without having some repercussions for that. And I hate to see the Philadelphia Symphony go under.
Let me connect this point to the bigger commercial culture for a second, which is not your province in this job, but still I know you have views about. To what extent is the spread of perhaps smaller, not necessarily artistically great cultural institutions a sort of reaction to the complete kind of coarsening of the commercial culture? That you can understand altruistic people, whether they be artists or the people who want to support artists, wanting to fight back against, even a Broadway theater where, as we know, I'm exaggerating, half the shows on Broadway are jukebox musicals or flimsy adaptations of mediocre movies, this sort of stuff. But seriously, there was always.
We won't mention any examples.
There was always commercial crap on Broadway, but the fact is that it's a higher percentage, even as there's some very good stuff. But it's also true, in movies. For instance, as you know, I do some work at HBO.
Right.
HBO has found that the kind of movies that used to be made by studios, the adult movie, grown-up movies, they're all offered to HBO because no studio wants to make them. They all want to make movies that are franchise, tentpole movies appealing to 14-year-old boys. That's why, HBO can get Todd Haynes to do Mildred Pierce. So the whole culture is shifting in such a way. How does that intersect with the nonprofit arts world and the NEA world and the dynamic of what's going on there now?
Well, one of the points you just made in passing is an important one. which is, I think there's been a shift in terms of where you go, where you would normally go to Broadway to see a Paddy Chayefsky drama, you now turn on HBO. And it's not an accident that when Mike Nichols wanted to make a film version of Angels in America, it was done through HBO. Television is the most interesting place right now, I think, to be artistically. That's where the most interesting work is going on, because with so many producers and so many and such a diversity of audience, you can on television do the things you couldn't normally do on Broadway or in mainline movies. So television, I mean, Debbie and I, when we have a night off, we sit at home and put on a taping of Mildred Pierce or Mad Men or whatever it is that we want to watch, and that's a very recent and significant shift.
Right, and look at, I know you talked to Bob Hurwitz of None Such Records about this. Look what's going on in music. And we're now talking about not classical music, although to some extent we are, because Bob Hurwitz, for those of you who don't know, he runs what's the last real label in records, if you can say there is a record industry, that, does Brad Mehldau, it does Steve Reich, it does Phil Glass, John Adams, Bjork, abandoned by commercial labels. That could disappear. If Warner Music sold, that could disappear. So even that is going. Even what we think of as pop music or high-end art music, can the NEA wade into situations like that and help?
Our resources are too limited, but we try. The marketplace cannot be the only determinant of what gets produced in many of these art forms, and it's up to the NEA and private sector foundations and individuals to support that. But it's an uphill slog. I do think that Broadway is still very important as one of the few places where a playwright, where a designer, a director can actually make a living, where you actually are decently compensated for what you do. I hope Broadway doesn't go away, but we need to support all kinds of other work besides the work that's going to be done in that marketplace.
One of the perverse things about the digitalization is a pet theory of mine anyway, that's been devastating to the record industry, to some extent to the book industry, certainly to the journalism industry, network television, is that the commercial theater has actually done very well, even during the recession, shockingly well, because I think people still want that live experience, no matter what, even at high ticket prices.
It's a sword that cuts two ways. Theater has become very, very expensive to produce because it is labor intensive, it's handmade. There are in the theater no economies of scale or mechanization, digitalization, electronic is, making it electronic. There's no advantage to that when you produce theater. It's live, handmade that night. And that's a terrible disadvantage as an economic model. On the other hand, it's our saving grace because it is not something easily duplicatable. It's not something that can easily be digitalized and reproduced. So people have to encounter it live that moment, that night. And there's a tremendous hunger, I think, for that kind of live, present experience. And the theater is going to always survive, I think, because of that, and is less vulnerable than those other media that you mentioned.
Well, it's just like sports, obviously, and also
right.
in the pop music industry, live performances replaced records. Someone told me a story, it may have been apocryphal a few years ago, that Wicked, which is this huge Broadway hit, like any hit show now, there are tons of bootleg, illegal videotapings of it, or videos of it.
But it's not the same experience.
It's not, and Wicked considered...
For better or worse.
And what I heard, yeah, exactly, and Wicked considered trying to shut it down, legally, because they thought 12-year-old kids, would feel they'd seen the show, but they found out, no, it was actually advertising for the show, and the people understood the difference. Let's talk about money. Let's talk particularly about these rather, I think the most revolutionary thing you've done at the NEA is completely reconsider and revamp the whole issue of how you get funding, how you collaborate with foundations like this one, with the private sector, and with other government agencies. Could you talk about what you're doing in all those areas and what it means and where it's going?
Well, our money is so small.
Pathetic.
Yes, I was at a presentation the other day in Chicago, and an architect, Tom Main, had a chart on which he had HUD and the Department of Transportation and the Department of Education, all on this chart. And the NEA was a speck literally that you could not see. Our funding is $168 million or something like that. England is the worst funder in Europe by far. They're by far the worst. Their public funding is $900 million, which would translate into the United States on a per capita basis of an NEA budget of $4.6 billion. So we're a little behind the curve. So it did occur to me when I came in, do I want to spend 4 years working with Congress and the administration to get our budget up $10 million or to keep it from going down $20 million, when in the whole scheme of things, this is very incremental. And not, if part of the job is to get resources out into the field and to get real support for artists and for arts organizations, do I want to spend 4 years thinking about $10 million? And I felt we needed substantial new funding, both for its actual impact, but also for its symbolic and psychological meaning as well, which we can get to later. But the first thing that happened after I was nominated for this job, my wife Debbie, who calls herself a philanthropoid, she's had a career in philanthropy. The next day she said, "You've got to call Luis Ubiñas. You've got to start making contacts in the foundation world." I called him the next day and came over here to meet with him. That was the beginning of a very significant initiative that we're now starting. Luis and I, here in this building, hosted a meeting of the top arts funders in the country, basically the top seven or so arts funders, with the idea: can we fund a consortium that can work alongside the NEA in the work that it's doing in relation to art and community development and art, what I like to call the intersection of art and the real world, which foundations like Ford, like Kresge, are now starting to be interested in strategic giving, and art that does have a relationship to the world as we actually know it. And that has really come together and is going to be, I think, not only a source of funding in the private sector, in the foundation community, but a tremendous leverager of additional foundations, corporate, private support, and we're already starting to see people waiting in line to join that and asking if they can join it. So that's going to be a significant lever of resources.
What kind of people are waiting in line to join?
Other foundations, individuals, corporations, who want to be maybe not at the level that Ford is, but want to participate in what Art Place is going to be. And private sector, a significant private sector relationship with the NEA has never existed before. It's always been.
Why?
A lot of reasons. I think first of all, the NEA for a long time was just radioactive. People didn't want to go there for whatever reason. I think it was to some degree considered just a government agency. Why would you? They have their own funding. They're funded by Congress. And it wasn't just something. It wasn't something that happened, and I think now there's a potential for a very, very significant relationship between the NEA and the private sector as a result of this, and at the same time, and I think that's going to be a multiplier, a genuine resource multiplier throughout the private sector. But at the same time, something I think very, very exciting is happening in the public sector, which is an engagement by many of the federal agencies alongside the NEA to multiply our resources through their, shall we say, vastly larger resources. Kathleen Sebelius at HHS is maybe my best friend in Washington, and she loves to remind me that she has 11 agencies at HHS, and in the smallest of them, the tiniest of the 11, our entire budget would be a rounding error. It wouldn't even be noticed. And yet there are intersections, and we just had a day-long session with Kathleen and her people at HHS a few weeks ago. There are intersections, but obvious intersections, between the arts and childhood development, mental health, geriatrics. Many of her departments, the arts have played and can play a much greater role, and there should be a relationship between the NEA and HHS. Similarly with with Sean Donovan, who came out of the housing job in New York, where he spent a lot of time dealing with the Department of Cultural Affairs and putting up a housing project on 10th Avenue that would include 3 theaters.
He's the head of HUD, by
HUD,
the way.
right.
Yes, you go on.
And so HUD recently published a NOFA, a Notice of Funding Availability. I never knew what NOFA was until a few months ago. In $100 million, in which arts organizations were invited to apply for HUD funding, directly to HUD. And the NEA and HUD together sit on the panel to determine where the money goes and where it's spent. This is new territory for the NEA.
This is absolutely fascinating to me, and you don't have to. I know you probably can't.
Department of Transportation, the Department of Agriculture.
I know you can't.
Education.
You can't give specific examples with proper names attached, probably, but a proposal comes in, and for the first time, it's a joint NEA, Department of Transportation, or Health and Human Services panel making the judgment on what's going to be funded or not. How does that work? I mean, do the people speak the same language?
They do now. A big hallmark of this particular administration, and I don't think they've gotten the attention or the credit for it they deserve, is that these cabinet secretaries, these agencies, shouldn't just live in their own silos, but should really collaborate and work together. And there's a Sustainable Communities program, for instance, that involves HUD, Department of Transportation, and EPA. Well, that consortium is doing significant funding in the arts with our participation, and sometimes this is done formally, as with the HUD grant, or the Department of Education recently put out their own Promise Neighborhoods initiative, another $100 million, in which the arts are now a preferred metric, or a consideration to be taken in for the first time, to be taken into account when funds are being appropriated in the Department of Education. Well, this is new territory for us, and someplace where we haven't been before. Department of Agriculture is talking about their community facilities program, and taking a certain percentage of their funding to be used for art, for artists' access, design, artists live and workspace, et cetera. And there are a lot of times when this can be done on either formal or informal basis. The Department of Transportation just made a $26 million grant for a light rail line in St. Louis, my hometown, which now has an arts aspect because it connects the arts corridor in Delmar Boulevard with the Art Museum in Forest Park and the zoo. And if there's an art dimension, these programs are going to have another aspect than they would before, because now, for the first time, the Department of Transportation doesn't think of themselves as just about engineering and road building. They think of themselves as about quality of life, sustainability. And when you're talking about quality of life, you're talking about aesthetics, you're talking about the arts. And the Secretary of Transportation, Ray LaHood, gets this. And for the first time, I think the arts have a place at the table. In the West Wing, in domestic policy, to me, this is the most exciting thing that could possibly have happened. And I hope that that's something that's going to continue and grow. It's a major source of new funding for the arts, but even more important than that is the symbolic aspect that it's in the structure of the federal government. That it's not just in the East Wing; it's part of what goes on in the West Wing, and I think that's terribly important.
Yeah, because usually people may not know. I know from having covered it is often the arts, including in Democratic administrations, has just been like it's the First Lady's work,
Right.
and it's sort of one step above inviting the Salahis to the White House and have party planning.
Well, I mean, the First Lady is very engaged with the arts, but
No,
but
yeah,
but
I'm not talking about this
it
administration.
needs to be in both sides of the White House.
I want to ask, we're going to go to questions from the audience in 1 second. I just want to ask you one more question of my own. You don't want to use the word legacy, but one thing you've talked about with me and others is not only that the arts are embedded in these agencies and in the funding of them and in the infrastructure of government, but also that arts are more embedded in the whole idea of America and America's sense of itself. Could you talk about that a bit?
Well, yes. I mean, arts are fundamental to our humanity. I mean, everyone in this room knows this. We wouldn't be here if we hadn't had, at some point in our life, an engagement with a in my case, it was the first time I saw Long Day's Journey in the Night when I was a college freshman. We've all had some experience with a work of art that's changed us, that's profoundly altered who we are and how we look at the world. And the aesthetic impulse, the need to draw pictures and tell stories and put on plays there was. We know that women sung to their children before there was language. Before language was separated from song, there was song. That there was music first. These are fundamental, elemental parts of who we are as human beings. As important as food, as shelter, as anything else that we do. And if we believe that, then the nation has to recognize that. It has to be part of our public policy, as it is much more so in Europe and other places in the world. And part of that, I think, is embedding the arts and engagement with the arts into the structure of the entire federal government. I've been going around saying I'm a little bit like the cuckoo bird, which lays its eggs in other birds' nests. So the other birds will raise the offspring and take care of them because we don't have the resources to do them. But the other agencies with their vast resources might be able to do that, and that's been one of my goals.
Good. If you can keep that out of abortion politics, you'll really
Not likely.
you'll really avoid a culture war. Let's have some questions. Bill Ivey, I see. Hi, Bill.
Does everyone know who Bill Ivey is? One of my illustrious predecessors and mentors. Turn it on.
It's on, yes. I'm Bill Ivey. I think I was your mother's NEA chairman. You're not your mother's NEA chairman.
Not so
I'm the
fast.
director of the Curb Center for Art Enterprise and Public Policy at Vanderbilt University, and I was asked by our program organizers to just ask a couple of questions to get things started.
By the way, I don't know where I'd be without Bill Ivey today. The second call I made was to Bill Ivey, and we had breakfast, and he sort of gave me the lay of the land in terms of what to expect at the NEA.
And Rocco has done wonderfully with it. I must say, though, any of you who've encountered me in a talk or any of the things I've written over the last few years know that I feel strongly that the U.S. needs a Department of Cultural Affairs and that we need a kind of hub such as the Environmental Protection Agency provides to environmental concerns, around which to have conversations not only about funding of the nonprofit arts, but also about things like creative elbow room in the for-profit arts industries and media ownership and access to the internet for everyone, a whole range of cultural issues that I think from the conversation that we heard earlier this afternoon, obviously those things are interconnected. So that belief of mine forms the background of my question. Rocco, I've got one for Rocco and one for Frank. Rocco, you've done such a great job of taking the NEA as it has existed, something that's moved from a budget of $100 million up to close to $200 million and then back over the last 30 years, and finding clever ways to access different pockets of money. But do you think that it's also essential, since we're talking about fresh angles on the arts today, even as you're being creative with the old model and cobbling together things that work and grow it a bit, to really think about a totally different approach, to back up and maybe in the sense of walking and chewing gum at the same time or rubbing your head and patting your head and rubbing your stomach, to try to off to the side figure out an entirely new way of going at this. Because everything the two of you have said gives a very strong impression that the cultural ecology in the U.S. is really out of whack right now.
You're not talking about a different kind of NEA. You're talking about a much bigger picture look at how the arts are funded in the country and
I'll put it,
supported.
can the NEA become that thing, or do we have to look at something entirely different?
I don't think the NEA in the current environment, and I think you know this, Bill, probably better than anyone, we're not going to have a cabinet arts position in this environment where the sentiment in Congress is to cut, reduce. There would probably be no worse optics than to try to create yet another federal agency right now, or with a bigger imprint. I think the mood in Congress would not accommodate that at all. Ultimately, long term, I think we should join the ranks of the developed nations in the world. and have a more vigorous engagement with the arts officially. Yes, I do believe that. I think we're a ways away from that, unfortunately.
And Frank, a question for you. You know, you wrote in your final column at the Times that you look for narrative in the many competing dramas unfolding on the national stage, and you've drawn on primarily American popular culture over the years. You know, building a whole column around the differences between True Grit and you know, The Social Network and so on. You talked pretty seriously about the deterioration in that world, and we've seen not only record labels, film studios, traditional television networks, newspapers, a whole range of these institutions that really built our 20th century cultural heritage really come on hard times. We intervened in the auto industry. We've intervened in other industries. And while there's been plenty of hand-wringing, do you think somehow we've missed a bet by not trying to weigh in ways that help sustain everything from mom and pop record stores and bookstores all the way over to mergers in the record business? Should we have done more?
Well, I think it's a good question, Bill. I think the story isn't over yet. I think what you're describing, we see the embryonic version in what Rocco's doing with, indeed, a pathetic budget, but with someone, in the case of Rocco, if I may say so, has incredible leadership and a vision of this, and so knows what should happen, even if he, as he said, he's laying eggs all over the place. He can't execute it all himself. You don't have the means to do it. But I'm hoping, there are areas where I think that the government can and should make a difference. There's somewhere they should stay out. The government should not be involved in subsidizing anything that resembles journalism, for instance, which is a big debate in the journalism profession, but I feel very strongly nothing good can come of that at all. But I do think the None Such example is a perfect example, because essentially it may seem like a small piece of it, but it's sort of a metaphor for the whole thing. What you have is a record label that is actually profitable, barely, I imagine, I don't know for a fact, but it is profitable, that has become, in essence, a little NEA in the for-profit world, because the way Bob Hurwitz runs it is, if he can, people like Emmylou Harris, who've lost or been divorced by, or
Amazing.
their major label, or alienated from them, go to him, and they still do make money. So that, and it's high grade, and then that can subsidize, as Bob's bringing out right now, some pretty small John Adams pieces on a CD, and even more obscure stuff. We've seen this happen in book publishing, where a few canny book publishers have been able, by putting a couple of commercial things on the list, to support, high-end literary writers that are never going, even if they get great reviews in New York Times Book Review, are never going to sell a ton of copies. But ultimately, there's a reason, if the government is involved in subsidizing the National Gallery, or the National Portrait Museum, something I think it should maybe stop subsidizing, but anyway, there's no reason why it shouldn't subsidize the recordings of John Adams, the recordings of Steve excuse me, the tail end of a cold, of dance, the preservation of all sorts of performing arts stuff that may not be preserved, not just the performance of it. And that's all a frontier that we can't talk about really in these fiscal times and in this political climate about the budget that has become even bigger than the political climate about Maplethorpe and all the history of the NEA fights.
What about controlling mergers
Well, I think that
Right.
mergers, that's a whole separate issue about the state of antitrust enforcement. I think it's not good in this administration, as in the previous one, but that's a whole other issue. But yes, of course.
Let's take a bunch of questions all in a row and see if we can.
Okay, back
God,
there.
there's so many.
Oh,
I'm Margaret Ayers from the Robert Sterling Clark Foundation. You talked about embedding interest in the arts within a lot of domestic agencies. Have you given any thought to developing some kind of a linkage with the State Department to promote mutual engagement, arts engagement with other countries? And if so, how would you do it?
Let's take a couple more. Can we take a couple more and just get a bunch here?
Okay.
The opening part of your conversation
Hey, Tim.
was a bit of a downer that the old day that all these changes are producing a lot of problems and in terms of the quality of art.
Tim, tell them who you are, by the way.
Tim Tompkins
Right.
from the Times Square
Okay.
Lights.
Right.
Where are the places where you see the larger changes in society and culture and technology doing great things for the arts, and what does that mean for people who produce art and for funders of art?
Hi, I'm LaRue Allen from the Martha Graham Center, and I want to go back to your comment about demand, supply and demand. We find that when we are in even a slightly subsidized house, and we can sell a ticket for in the $65 range, we sell out. When we have to go into a larger house and reach even as far as, say, $95 to cover that additional production expense, we can't do it, and we have to discount. So I'm wondering what you feel the difference is between demand and resources in the ticket department.
Oscar Eustace from the Public Theater.
Hi, Oscar.
Hi, Rocco, who I love more than life itself. And before I just point out, there's something a little disconnected to me about hearing the head of the NEA sitting at the Ford Foundation wondering why in the last 30 years the nonprofit theaters have become more commercial. It's because the funding went away. That the absolute promise of the start of this movement was that there would be significant national funding based on artistic excellence for theaters around the country. That went away after Reagan was elected in a long move, and the theaters, some of whom I'm extremely critical of, some of whom I'm supportive of, have all needed to find other ways to stay alive, and one of the corollaries of that that's been deadly is that it's easier for institutions to figure out how to keep institutions alive than to figure out how to keep artists alive. And, you know, Frank, when we moved Bloody Bloody, Andrew Jackson's Bride, may have been foolish, but you know who it wasn't foolish for? The young artists, the 35 young artists who for 6 months, for the first time in their careers, made a living from their work. That's the impetus that we're trying to fix. And again, it's a vexed field. But
I just want to say one thing there, and then I think Rocco should answer all these questions, not just this one. They're all for you. Yes, they were employed for 6 months, but the millions of dollars that were lost in renting a Broadway house could have supported many more, and building a physical production. It's still millions of dollars down the drain that could have supported other artists. So it's not quite that simple equation. But I want Rocco to answer.
Well, in no particular order, Oscar, I think I was bemoaning the effect without giving due recognition to the cause. I mean, we all know that. We all know that there's a crisis in the not-for-profit, an area that we know, the theater sector, but I'm sure that's multiplied throughout art museums and ballets and operas and throughout the country. And it's a very serious problem. It goes back to Bill Ivey's question: is do we have to start to have a real rethink about how there can be significant support for these institutions in a way that, and for the artists in a way that we used to have much more of and much less of now. And it's a real challenge. And all I can try to do is use the bully pulpit that I have to at least start that conversation, because it's a crisis. And I agree with you. So about the State Department, and I do want to take this question too, because you had your hand up. Go ahead, ask it, and I'll put it in. Okay, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask a question representing all those people in this room who are here because of their museum affiliation and the visual arts, that we could have a little bit of discussion about that field, because it is one where there is huge vitality today, serving incredibly diverse audiences, and excuse me, in a crisis with globalization, and I think it needs to be part of this discussion.
Great. I tend to naturally talk less about it since I know so much less about it. And I'm, my learning curve is steep, and I've been making a point of going around the country to bring myself up to speed a little bit. I think we do have data that attendance at museums, there are many exceptions to this, has been declining over time. And so I think there are some parallels between the museum universe and the performing arts, which I'm more familiar with. But I think that, yes, that is a very, very important arena and deserves at least as much attention. There's no question. Let me go back to the question. Let me just take the questions as best I can remember them, and I'm not going to remember them all, so you'll remind me. The State Department. The State Department. The State Department is unbelievably vast and Byzantine. So, I'll tend to have a conversation there, and everyone will say, yes, let's go, and then in 6 months, someone gets back to us on something and has forgotten what we were talking about. It's a natural place to for us to engage. I remember there was a speech at Americans for the Arts retreat in Sun Valley that Debbie attended, where they had a General Bivens, retired general, speaking. And he made the point that the arts may have a much bigger role coming up in international affairs and diplomacy because of the way the world is right now. It used to be that your most feared enemy was your most powerful enemy. That Russia, with all its nuclear arms, the Soviet Union, was our most feared adversary. Now the most feared adversary is the least powerful, because that can be the most dangerous. And when you're talking about protecting yourself against that or engaging that, you're not talking about armaments, really. You're talking about culture. You're talking about finding ways for there to be a real dialogue or understanding. And art, I think, has a big role in that. So we are trying to get a foothold in the State Department and the Defense Department. One of our recent initiatives that I'm most proud of is an initiative called Blue Star Museums, speaking of museums, in which we've cooperated with an organization called Blue Star Families that represents all the active servicemen and women in the country. And we instituted the program with, it was then 900, this summer it's going to be 1,200 or more. Most of the big museums in the country, including yours and including all the big ones and most of the small ones, where servicemen and their families can attend any museum in the United States from Memorial Day to Labor Day for free, which is great for the servicemen. I think it's great for the museums. And one of the things we do know, and because it's families, one of the things we know for sure, because we have a lot of data on it, is that the biggest indicator of participation in the arts is exposure when you're young, youth, arts education and exposure to art at a young age. So, but we're engaging all these agencies.
There was the Martha Graham question about the pricing.
Yes, but I think when you're in the real world, when you're talking about a price point that's going to engage participation, you're talking about subsidy, and I think you've got to have subsidized audience programs to get the audiences there. I think that goes naturally together.
And there was also Tim's question about now. What's the good
okay.
news? That's right.
Oh, yes. Well, the good news. That's actually an important question. The good news is that we're finding that we're starting to, we think, significantly underestimate arts participation because of the way that it's accessed. We're getting increasingly interested in what Sunil Inagar, our data person, our research person, calls the informal arts, which might be arts that are not necessarily in the marketplace in terms of people buying tickets, garage bands or people or amateur painters or crafts makers or so forth. But more than that, the arts that are accessed digitally and without being there necessarily a record of someone attending somewhere, a lot more people are accessing arts for in ways that we haven't been able to collect the data about yet. And what we're starting to find out in the initial data collection that we have is that people who have accessed arts in these unorthodox ways, like through mobile phones and so forth, turn out to be much greater participants in person at the institutions. They're much more likely to go and to go frequently. So we're just at the verge of finding out what that's about, and it's an important new area for us.
Well, on that optimistic note, I think we're out of time and have to
I could have
conclude.
gone on all afternoon with this. It was great.
Thank you for being here. Thank you
always-
for all you're doing in Washington.
A big round of applause for Rocco Landesman and Frank Ridge.
Thank you. That was fun. That was great.